Good evening and welcome back. The hour has grown still, and the room around you has begun the slow practice of letting go of the day. The lamps are low, the corners have softened. Whatever the morning brought, whatever the afternoon asked, whatever the evening still holds in its small, busy hands, you may begin now, little by little, to set it down. There is no urgency here. The story we are about to enter is older than urgency. It has waited a long time already. It will wait, patient as a stone wall, for as much of your attention as you can give before sleep takes you. Let your shoulders settle. Let your jaw rest. Let your hands lie wherever they have come to rest, open or folded, whichever feels more natural to the body that has carried you this far. There is no pose to maintain tonight. There is no question to answer before the morning. The day, with all its rough edges, may now begin its slow folding away into memory, and the night, kind and old, may begin to gather you up. Tonight, we enter the story of Athena, the grey-eyed daughter of Zeus, the goddess of wisdom and weaving and strategy, and the disciplined mind, the patron of the great city that would carry her name across centuries. She is one of the central figures of the old Greek world, the friend of heroes, the keeper of crafts, the one whose owl turns its round head in the dark of every temple where her image has ever stood. Her story is full of bright and quiet detail, a birth from her father's head, a contest over a hill, a strange and tender friendship with a girl named Pallas, a feud with a mortal weaver, and the long unseen support she gave to certain wanderers who crossed her path. We will move through these images slowly. We will not press them. We will let them rise and fade like figures painted faintly on the wall of an old temple. Get cozy, settle in, and let us begin. You may close your eyes if your eyes wish to close. The story will keep its shape without you watching it. The Greeks who first told it would have understood. They told their stories often around fires in the dark hours when the work of the day had ended and the bodies of the listeners had begun their own quiet slumber. The teller continued. The listener slept or did not sleep, as the listener wished. The story carried on regardless, and it kept its dignity because the teller knew that dignity does not require an audience that is always awake. In the beginning of this telling, we must step back, before Athena was born, into the older household of Olympus, where her father Zeus had only recently come into his rule. The Titanomachy had ended. The Titans were sealed away beneath the world, kept by the 100-handed guardians who had been freed from the deep pit and who, in gratitude, had agreed to take up that long watch. The new gods were arranging themselves into their household. The marriage of Zeus and Hera was not yet the long-settled thing it would later become. The Olympian halls were still new, and the smiths who had built them had only just laid down their tools, and the high air around the summit of the mountain still carried, in places, the smell of burning bronze from the great forges of construction. Before he married Hera, Zeus had loved another, an older being, the goddess Metis. Her name in Greek means cunning thought, careful contrivance, the particular kind of wisdom that knows how to find a way through a difficult problem. Metis was the daughter of Okeanos and Tethys, two of the great Titan elders, and she had been Zeus's first counselor, the one who had given him the herb that freed his swallowed brothers and sisters from the belly of Kronos. Without Metis, the war against the Titans might not have been won. She was a quiet figure in the old myths, less famous than the louder gods, but central to the entire turning of the cosmos, from the rule of the elders to the rule of the new. Imagine her as the old poets imagined her. She was tall and grave. Her eyes were the color of deep water. Her voice was the voice of someone who had thought before she spoke. She was older than Zeus by an unknown measure of time, the way all the children of the great Titan houses were older than the Olympians, and she carried in her bearing the long memory of the world before the war. She was patient. She was kind. She was, in some old descriptions, terrifying in her quiet, because to be truly wise is sometimes to know things that the unwise would find unbearable. When the war was over, Zeus and Metis loved one another. Metis became pregnant. The cosmos was about to receive a new child, a daughter, the first of the next generation of the great gods. The household of Olympus prepared itself in its quiet way for the new arrival. The seasons turned, the sky turned. The newly freed Cyclopes hammered at their forges in the deep caves of the world, and the sound of their hammers became, in some traditions, the sound of the unborn child's heartbeat as Metis carried her. But an oracle came to Zeus. The oracle was delivered in some traditions by Earth herself, who had a long memory and who knew the shapes of futures the way an old gardener knows the shapes of seasons. In other traditions, the oracle came from sky falling back into his far quietness, who spoke a final word before withdrawing entirely. Either way, the message was the same. Metis would bear 2 children. The first would be a daughter, equal to her father in wisdom and courage. The second would be a son, who would surpass his father and overthrow him, as Zeus had overthrown Kronos, and as Kronos had unseated Sky. Zeus, when he received this oracle, was caught between 2 truths he could not resolve. He loved Metis. He longed for the daughter. But he had seen, with the particular vividness of one who had himself ended his father's reign, what happened when a king tried to keep his throne against the future. He had not forgotten the cave on Crete. He had not forgotten his own hidden childhood. He did not want to be Kronos. He did not want to swallow his children. He had won his war, in part, by being different from his father. To become his father now would be to undo what he had built. But he also did not want to be overthrown. The thought of the unborn son growing inside Metis, growing into a being who would one day come for him, settled inside him like a cold stone. He thought about it for many days. He spoke of it to no one. The oracles do not always tell their recipients what to do about what they have learned. They tell only the future. The decision is left to the one who has heard. So he found another way. He went to Metis, the wise one, and he spoke with her gently. He proposed a game in some versions of the story in which they would take turns becoming smaller. Metis, who could change her form as easily as breath, agreed to play. She did not know, perhaps, that the game was more than a game, or perhaps she did know and chose to play anyway, with the kind of accepting wisdom that the old myths sometimes attributed to her. The poets are ambiguous on this point, and we will not press the question. Some loves end in willing surrender, others end in surprise. The old singers did not always say which kind of ending this was. Metis became a fly. She became a small lizard. She became finally a drop of dew hanging on the rim of a cup. And Zeus, watching her become small, lifted the cup and drank her down. She entered him in the form of a single shining droplet. She slid down his throat. She came to rest in some deep place within him, where the unborn child still floated in the membrane of her own becoming. This is one of the strangest moments in Greek myth, and the old singers told it with care. Zeus did not destroy Metis. He took her into himself. He absorbed her as the river absorbs the small spring that feeds it. From that moment on, Metis lived inside Zeus, continuing the work of carrying the child, continuing also her own life as wisdom. The old poets understood that this was not the same as the swallowing of children by Kronos. Kronos had swallowed in fear. Zeus had swallowed in another spirit altogether, a spirit that was perhaps half love, half calculation, half the strange dream logic of myth that resists easy explanation. Metis was inside him. The unborn daughter was inside him. The cosmos waited. The years passed. The household of Olympus continued its early arrangement. Zeus married Hera, and that marriage began its long, complicated history. The new household took shape. Hera as queen, Hestia tending the central hearth, Demeter beginning her care of the grain, Poseidon coming and going from his sea, Hades coming up rarely from his deep halls, and Ares and Hebe and Eileithyia being born to Zeus and Hera in their proper turns. But somewhere inside the king of the gods, in a place no one else could see, Metis went on with her work. She wove, she thought, she prepared the daughter. She also, in some traditions, prepared armor for the child, hammering small bronze on a small forge that existed only inside her husband's chest. The image is wild, and the old singers loved it. Inside Zeus, somewhere below the level of his ordinary awareness, Metis was hammering and weaving and shaping, getting the child ready. Then came the headache. It began, the old story says, as a small pressure behind the eyes. Zeus had felt no pain in his immortal body since he had become king. The discomfort was unfamiliar. He set it aside. The next day, the headache was worse. The day after that, worse still. The pain grew until it shook the high halls of Olympus. The other gods, alarmed, gathered around their king. They had no idea what was happening. Hera, perhaps secretly amused, perhaps genuinely concerned, watched from her throne. Apollo and Artemis, who would later become healers in different ways, were not yet born to help. Hermes, the future messenger, had not yet arrived. Olympus had no doctor. Zeus, in his agony, called for Hephaistos, the smith god, the master of metalwork. Hephaistos, who was already part of the household by various traditions, came carrying his great double-bitted axe. Zeus looked at his smith. He asked Hephaistos to split his head open to relieve whatever was inside that needed to come out. Hephaistos hesitated. To strike the head of the king of the gods was no light thing, but Zeus insisted. The pain had become unbearable. Hephaistos raised his axe. He brought it down on the crown of Zeus's head. The skull opened, not in the messy way a mortal skull would open, but with the careful precision of a divine instrument operating on a divine body. From the opened head of Zeus stepped a fully grown goddess, grey-eyed, armed in bronze, with helmet and spear, and a great round shield. And as she stepped forth, she gave a battle cry that shook the columns of Olympus and made the surrounding sea swell against its shores. Some old poets said the sun stood still for a moment. Some said the rivers, in their distant valleys, paused in their flowing. The cosmos noticed her arrival. This was Athena. She had been carried in her father's head, made ready by her mother inside her father's body, brought forth by an axe. She did not cry as an infant cries. She did not stumble. She simply was, in the moment of her emergence, the goddess of wisdom and strategy and craft, full and complete, as if all the years of her gestation had counted as the years of an ordinary childhood, and she had simply been waiting for the door to open. Her grey eyes took in the hall of Olympus. Her bronze armour caught the light. Her spear rested easily in her hand. The image is one of the loveliest and strangest in all the old myth, a goddess born from a head, wisdom carried in the mind rather than the womb, the mother absorbed but still present, hammering and weaving from a hidden place, the father releasing a daughter who would never quite be his to command. The Greeks turned this story over and over and never quite tired of it. It seemed to say something they could not say in any other way, that the deepest kinds of knowledge are not produced by ordinary processes, that wisdom sometimes arrives fully formed, that the relationship between teacher and pupil, parent and child, source and creation, is not always a tidy lineage. There are kinds of birth that are not from the body alone. The old singers, when they reached this moment, often paused. They would let the image hang in the listener's mind. A daughter, armed, standing in the bright hall of Olympus, lifting her grey gaze to her father, with his head healed by some divine art, looking back at her, Hephaestus lowering his axe, perhaps a little astonished at what he had just helped to bring forth, the other gods silent, the world having just received a new presence, and the new presence not needing anything from anyone, not crying, not asking, not stumbling, only standing. Athena, in those first moments, surveyed the household into which she had been born. She saw her father and recognized him, though they had never spoken before. She saw Hera, who looked at her with the mixed feelings that Hera tended to have toward Zeus's children by other mothers, though in this case the mother was less than ordinary, the mother being inside the father, the mother being part of the goddess herself. She saw the other gods. She saw the high halls. She saw, perhaps, in her grey gaze, the whole long future stretching ahead of her. The city she would one day name, the heroes she would one day support, the contest she would one day win against her uncle Poseidon, the long centuries of being honoured in temples and small altars across the Greek-speaking world. She did not, however, immediately step into her role as a great goddess. She had a youth of her own in some traditions, though it was not exactly the childhood of an ordinary girl. She was raised, the old stories say, by the river god Triton in the far reaches of Libya, near a lake or river that bore his name. Why she went to Triton is not always explained. Perhaps Zeus sent her there, knowing that a goddess born from his head would need a quieter place to grow accustomed to being a person before taking up her duties. Perhaps Athena herself chose to go. Perhaps the old poet simply needed a place to put her between her birth and her later deeds. The Greek tradition was honest about gaps in its own knowledge, and where the stories did not quite agree, the singers allowed several possibilities to remain in the air at once. At Triton's river, Athena was raised alongside Triton's own daughter, a girl named Pallas. The two of them were close companions, almost sisters. They played together, they learned together. They practiced in particular the arts of strategy and battle that Athena had inherited from her birth. Pallas, though mortal, was a strong young woman, quick with weapons, fierce in her mind. The two of them sparred often, sometimes in friendly contest, sometimes more seriously. They competed at running. They competed at swimming in the cool river. They competed at the careful weaving of small pieces of cloth on the loom that Triton had built for them. It is one of the few moments in the old mythology where Athena is allowed a childhood at all. Most goddesses come into their stories already fully realized, as Athena herself had at her emergence from Zeus's head. But the river of Triton gave her, for a little while, an experience of growing up alongside someone she loved. The Greeks treasured this small detail. They saw in it a small extra dimension of their goddess. She had known, however briefly, what it was to have a near sister, to share quiet hours with a friend, to lean against a riverbank in the evening and talk about nothing important. One day, the old story says, their sparring went wrong. They were practicing with spears, perhaps with shields, perhaps simply in a hand-to-hand exercise. Zeus, watching from above, saw that Pallas might wound his daughter. He did not want that, even in friendly play. He held up his Aegis, the great storm shield between the two of them, to protect Athena. The flash of the Aegis startled Pallas. She lowered her guard. Athena, in the middle of a strike she could not pull back, struck her friend. Pallas fell. It was an accident. The old poets are careful to make this clear. Athena had not meant to harm her friend. The interference of Zeus had caused the wound. But Pallas died of the blow, and Athena was inconsolable. The grief of Athena over Pallas is one of the tender details of her mythology, and the old singers told it gently. Athena, who had been born without needing anything from anyone, who had emerged fully grown and fully wise, did not know how to bear this loss. She had loved Pallas. She had not expected to lose her, certainly not by her own hand. She knelt beside her friend's body and wept, with the particular grief of someone who had thought herself beyond such things and was now learning suddenly that even goddesses can grieve. The river of Triton flowed on, indifferent. The reeds at the bank moved in their slow rhythm. Pallas lay still. In honor of her friend, Athena took the name Pallas as part of her own. From that day forward, she was often called Pallas Athena. The mortal girl's name lived on, attached to the goddess's name, carried into temple inscriptions and prayers across the Greek world for centuries to come. It is a small act of remembering, and it tells us something quiet about Athena's character. She did not let the death of her friend disappear. She wore the name. She carried it. She also, the old stories say, carved a wooden image in the likeness of Pallas, an image that came to be called the Palladium. The Palladium became a sacred object, a small statue of a young woman with shield and spear, the protector of cities. Wherever the Palladium stood, the old belief held, the city would not fall. Troy was said to have a Palladium. Rome, in later legend, was said to have inherited the Trojan Palladium and kept it safely in the Temple of Vesta. The wooden image of a mortal girl killed by accident had become a talisman of civic safety. Old myth makes its small dignities in this way. A friendship that ended badly became a sacred object that kept other friendships, other households, other cities intact. It is worth pausing here for a moment before we move into the larger arc of Athena's later deeds to feel the weight of this small loss. The Greeks were not the kind of myth-makers who shielded their gods from sorrow. They allowed their immortals to grieve, to love, to be foolish, to be wise, to be kind and cruel by turns. Athena's grief over Pallas was real to them, and the small wooden image she carved was an act of mourning before it became a civic talisman. She made it, the way mortals carve small wooden figures of those they have lost. The Palladium began as a private grief and only later became a public protection. The Greeks understood that the deepest civic gifts often have private origins of this kind. Good evening and welcome back. If your mind has wandered into the soft middle of the story, the household is full of figures now and the events have multiplied, but you do not need to hold them all. You may keep one image, the axe of Hephaestus, the grey eyes opening for the first time, the river of Triton, the girl named Pallas falling, the wooden image being carved with patient hands. Any one of these is enough to carry the shape of the story forward. Let us turn now to the contest that defined Athena most clearly in the old Greek imagination. It is the contest between Athena and Poseidon over the city that would become Athens. The Greeks loved this story. They told it many times with many variations. It explained, in their imagination, why their greatest city carried the name of the goddess of wisdom rather than the name of the god of the sea, and why the city's economy and culture were shaped the way they were. The story begins in the early days of the city, before it had a name, when it was only a settlement of small houses gathered around a high rock that would later be called the Acropolis. The people of the settlement had begun to need a patron god, a divine protector, who would watch over their growing community and whose temple would stand at the center of their civic life. They could not, in the Greek imagination, simply choose. The choice was a matter of divine interest, and two gods stepped forward to claim the city. Poseidon, lord of the sea, came first. He saw the high rock. He saw the small harbour below. He saw the potential for a great maritime city. He climbed to the top of the Acropolis. He struck the bare stone with his trident. From the place where the trident struck, a spring of water burst forth. Some traditions say the water was salt water, marking the spring as a sign of his dominion over the sea. Others say a horse leaped forth from the rock, his other great gift to the world. Either way, Poseidon's offering was made. He stood beside it, waiting. Athena came next. She also climbed the rock. She also made her offering, but she did not strike the ground with a weapon. She knelt instead, and from her hand she planted a small olive tree. The tree grew. Its silver-grey leaves opened. Its first small fruit appeared, the round, dark olives that would one day feed the city through good harvests and bad. She stood beside the tree, waiting. The people of the city, called upon to choose, considered the two gifts. Poseidon's water, or his horse, was magnificent. It offered the promise of maritime power, of swift travel, of conquest by sea. Athena's olive tree was smaller. It did not promise glory, but the olive tree offered something else: food, oil for lamps, oil for cooking, oil for anointing the body, wood for fire, and for building, a slow, steady gift that would last for centuries and that would never run out as long as the trees were tended. The people, with the wisdom of those who must plan for many seasons rather than for one bright moment, chose the olive tree. Athena was given the city. The city was named for her. The Acropolis was dedicated to her temple. The olive tree she had planted stood for centuries on the Acropolis, and even when later wars burned the city and the tree itself was burned down, it grew again from the stump, and the people of Athens took the regrowth as a sign that their goddess had not abandoned them. The story is famous in part because it is so quiet. There is no battle. There is no thunderbolt. There is no demonstration of power in the loud sense. There is only a tree growing on a rock beside a spring of salt water and a horse. The city chose the tree. The city chose, in some sense, patience over splendor. The goddess of wisdom rewarded the choice by being the city's patron, and the city, in its long history, became one of the great centers of philosophy and art and civic experiment that the ancient world would know. There is a quiet philosophy embedded in this choice that the Greeks honored even when they did not always live up to it. The choice of the olive tree was the choice of a long horizon over a short one. The salt spring would have been useful immediately. The horse would have offered swift military reward. The olive tree would not bear fruit for many years. The first generation that planted it would not eat from it. The second generation might begin to. The third generation would harvest in abundance. To choose the olive tree was to choose a city that thought across generations, that planted things its own people would never eat, that built temples its own grandchildren would never finish. This was the wisdom Athena offered, and it was not a wisdom easy to receive. To choose it required a kind of patience that not every people would have chosen. The Greeks themselves often did not live up to it. In their actual political lives, they fought wars they regretted. They burned cities they later mourned. But the olive tree on the Acropolis stood there, in the center of their imagination, as a reminder of what they could have been if they had been wiser. The patron of their city was patience itself. Even when they failed her, the tree was there. Poseidon, the losing god, did not take his loss well in every tradition. Some traditions say he flooded the plain around the city in his anger, and that the Athenians built dikes to hold back the water. Some say he accepted the loss with the rough dignity of an elder brother who has been outwise by a younger sister. Some say he and Athena remained, despite the contest, fellow patrons of the city in different aspects, with Poseidon honored at the harbor and Athena honored on the rock. The Greeks did not always insist on tidy outcomes. They allowed defeated gods their dignity. They allowed lost contests to leave traces in the landscape. There is more to Athena than this contest, of course. She was the goddess of weaving, and weaving was one of the central arts of the ancient world, the daily occupation of women of every class. To weave well was to perform an art that was both practical and sacred. The cloth that came from the loom would clothe the family, would adorn the temple, would be exchanged in trade, would be wrapped around the dead before burial. Athena watched over this work. A weaver invoking her at the beginning of a new cloth was asking for steady hands, for patience, for the slow accumulating sense of pattern that turns 1,000 small choices into a coherent garment. The most famous weaving story of Athena is the one about Arachne. We will tell it gently. Arachne was a mortal woman of Lydia, a kingdom in what is now Western Turkey. She was an exceptionally skilled weaver. The cloth that came from her loom was admired across her region. People came from far away to watch her work. She was, by all accounts, the best weaver of her generation. Her colors were exceptional. Her patterns were inventive. Her speed was startling. She had been weaving since she was a small child, and the loom was as natural to her hands as breathing. But she boasted. She said that her weaving was finer than Athena's. She said that the goddess of weaving could not match her. The boast traveled, as boasts do in old myth, until it reached Olympus. Athena came down to Arachne in the form of an old woman. She warned Arachne to soften her claims, to honor the goddess. Arachne was scornful. She told the old woman to mind her own business and to leave the loom to those who knew it. Athena revealed herself. She accepted Arachne's challenge. The two of them set up looms beside each other. They wove. Athena wove a tapestry of the gods in their wisdom and majesty. She wove the contest of the Acropolis with herself and Poseidon, the olive tree growing, the people choosing. She wove the punishments that had befallen mortals who had boasted against the gods, small warnings sewn into the corners of her cloth. Her tapestry was orderly. It was reverent. It told the story the gods would want, told about themselves. Arachne wove a tapestry of a different kind. She wove the gods at their less dignified moments, their disguises, their amours, their occasional cruelties. She wove Zeus appearing to mortal women in the form of a bull, a swan, a shower of gold. She wove Poseidon transforming himself to seduce other goddesses. She wove the small petty quarrels of the immortal household. Her weaving was, in pure technical terms, equal to or even better than Athena's. The thread did not show its joints, the colours blended like water. The figures moved on the cloth as if they might at any moment step off it. What happened next? The old story tells in several ways. In the gentler version, Athena, recognizing Arachne's skill but disturbed by her presumption and by the content of her weaving, struck Arachne with the shuttle. Arachne, in shame, prepared to hang herself. Athena, suddenly tender, would not let her die. She touched her, and Arachne's body changed. She became a spider, the small weaver of the wall and the corner, and her thread continued to be the thread of the loom, only now it was woven from her own body and her own patience. Arachne the weaver became the first spider, and all spiders since, the old story says, are her descendants. It is a difficult story, and the old tellers knew it. It honors skill but warns against pride. It punishes a mortal woman but does not destroy her. It transforms her into a being whose work goes on forever. We will not press it tonight. We will only carry from it the image of two looms standing side by side in a quiet workshop, and two weavers, immortal and mortal, working at the same craft with the same fierce attention. There is something in that image about the dignity of craft itself, and about the danger of imagining that craft alone, without the patience that craft requires, is enough. Skill without humility, in the old Greek imagination, was a kind of brittleness. It looked impressive until it shattered. Athena's role in the larger pattern of Greek myth was often to be the patron of certain heroes. She did not father them, she did not bear them, she watched them, she helped them when they needed help. She withheld her help when they needed to learn the limits of their own strength. The list of heroes she supported is long, and we will name only a few. Perseus, the slayer of Medusa, was given a polished bronze shield by Athena. With the shield, Perseus could look at the reflection of Medusa rather than at her face, and so could approach her without being turned to stone. The gift seems simple. It is, in the old Greek imagination, the gift of indirect vision, the wisdom of looking at a difficult thing through a mirror rather than directly. Athena gave Perseus the means to do his work without being undone by what he had to do. After he succeeded, he gave her, in return, the head of Medusa, which Athena set in the center of her Aegis. The head became part of her great storm shield, and any who looked at the shield in battle felt the cold quiet of stone enter their bones. Heracles, the great hero, was helped by Athena at several points in his 12 labours. When he had to drive the birds out of the Stymphalian marshes, Athena gave him a bronze rattle made by Hephaestos, with which he frightened the birds into flight. When he had to capture the Cretan bull, Athena stood by him, invisibly. When he had to descend into the underworld to bring up the great hound Cerberus, Athena was there at the threshold, calm and grey-eyed. Heracles was a hero of strength, but his strength was often complemented by Athena's quieter intelligence, and the partnership between them is one of the warm threads in the old mythology. When Heracles finally died and ascended to Olympus to become an immortal himself, Athena was among the first to welcome him into the high household. Odysseus, the wanderer of the Odyssey, was Athena's particular favourite. She loved his cleverness. She loved the way his mind worked, the way her own mind worked. She helped him at countless moments in his long 10-year voyage home from Troy. She came to him in disguise, sometimes as a young shepherd, sometimes as an old beggar, sometimes as his own herald, and she counselled him. She protected his son Telemachus. She arranged the final return to Ithaca. The Odyssey, in some sense, is as much Athena's story as it is Odysseus's. Without her, the long voyage would have ended badly. With her, it became one of the great old stories of homecoming. The closing scenes of the Odyssey, where Odysseus reveals himself to Penelope and to his old father Laertes, are watched over by Athena, standing just outside the frame, the quiet author of the happy ending. What Athena gave to her heroes was, in each case, the same thing. Not strength, not magical power, not invulnerability, but a certain quality of mind. Indirect vision, strategy, the willingness to wait when waiting was wiser than acting, the willingness to disguise oneself, to choose patience over splendor, to listen for the small sounds that meant the situation was about to change. She was the goddess of the prepared mind. She was, in her quietest aspect, the protector of those who thought before they acted. There was also her larger role in the Trojan War itself, that immense old conflict that the Greeks remembered as the foundational event of their heroic age. The war had been set in motion long before the first ship sailed, when the goddess Eris Discord threw a golden apple inscribed for the fairest among a wedding feast of the gods. 3 goddesses claimed it: Hera, Aphrodite, and Athena. They argued. Zeus, wise enough not to choose between his wife, his daughter, and the goddess of love, sent them down to a mortal shepherd named Paris on the slopes of Mount Ida, near Troy. Paris was to judge. Each goddess offered him a bribe. Hera offered him rulership over kingdoms. Athena offered him wisdom and victory in war. Aphrodite offered him the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, being young and not particularly wise, chose Aphrodite's gift. The most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, already married to Menelaus of Sparta. The choice set in motion the abduction of Helen, the gathering of the Greek ships, and the 10-year war that would end with the fall of Troy. Athena, having been rejected by Paris, took the Greek side in the war. She supported Odysseus. As we have seen, she supported Diomedes, the bold warrior who, with her direct help, even wounded Aphrodite and Ares on the field of battle. She supported the Greek strategy more broadly, advising the commanders, sometimes appearing on the battlefield, sometimes working through dreams sent to the chief generals. The fall of Troy, when it finally came, was achieved through the wooden horse, that famous deception attributed to Odysseus and built, in some traditions, with Athena's direct counsel. The horse stood inside the walls of Troy. The Trojans, deceived by Greek soldiers pretending to be deserters, brought it within their gates. At night, The Greeks hidden inside the horse emerged. The gates were opened. The city fell. Athena's role in the fall of Troy was complicated, however, and the old poets were honest about this. The fall of any city brings with it a darkness, and the sack of Troy was particularly cruel. There were sacrilegious acts, there were violations of the temples. Cassandra, the prophetess, was dragged from Athena's own sanctuary by Ajax the Lesser, a Greek warrior who paid no respect to the goddess's protection. Athena was furious. The desecration of her temple was an injury to her dignity. In a way she would not let pass, she turned against many of the Greeks on their voyages home, sending storms, sending shipwrecks, ensuring that the war did not end as cleanly as the victors had hoped. The hardest journeys of the homecoming heroes, including Odysseus's own 10-year voyage, were in part shaped by her anger at the Greek behavior at Troy. This was one of her sterner aspects. Athena was not always the gentle protector. She was also the goddess of just consequence. To violate her temples was to bring upon yourself a long, slow undoing that no later piety could fully cure. Ajax the Lesser would drown on the voyage home, his ship broken on a rock, his last cry an unanswered prayer. The Greek fleet would be scattered across the Mediterranean for years. Agamemnon, the chief commander, would return home only to be killed by his own wife. The price of the cruel sack of Troy was paid out, ship by ship, over the long years that followed. The old singers did not flinch from this part of the story. They knew that Athena, for all her wisdom, could be hard. The same grey eyes that watched over the careful weaving of cloth could also watch the slow turning of consequence as it caught up with men who had thought their victory was the end of the matter. Around this larger arc of the Trojan War, Athena's relationships with the other Olympian gods came into clearer view. She and Ares, the harsh god of war, were opposed in temperament. Ares loved battle for its own sake, for the noise and the blood, and the demonstration of strength. Athena loved the strategy of war, the careful arrangement of forces, the considered choice of when to fight and when to wait. Ares charged. Athena planned. When they appeared on the same battlefield, often on opposite sides, the contrast between them was sharp. In one famous moment in the Iliad, Athena, fighting alongside Diomedes, actually struck Ares with a spear and drove him from the field. The god of war shouted in pain, the old poet says, with the voice of 9,000 or 10,000 men. He fled to Olympus to complain to Zeus. Zeus, who had little patience for Ares's bluster, told him to be quiet and to heal. This was Athena's relationship with her brother of war. She did not respect him. She tolerated him as a member of the same household, but she was not above striking him with a spear when the situation required it. The Greeks loved this contrast. It told them something about what kind of intelligence was higher, not the intelligence of pure aggression, but the intelligence that knew how to use force or restraint in measured amounts. With Hephaistos, her smith brother, her relationship was warmer. They were both gods of craft, in different domains. Hephaistos worked in metal. Athena worked in cloth and in design. The two often collaborated. The Aegis was, in some traditions, partly her work and partly his. The bronze rattle she gave to Heracles was Hephaistos's making. Her own armor, the bronze she had been born wearing, had been hammered by her mother Metis inside her father's body. But the larger arsenal of Olympian weaponry was largely Hephaistos's domain, and Athena consulted him often. Together, they were the divine pair of intelligent making. The the two gods who knew how to turn raw material into useful and beautiful things. There was also, of course, her relationship with her father Zeus. Of all the children of Zeus, Athena was perhaps the closest to him, the one he confided in most easily, the one whose counsel he trusted most readily. She was, in some sense, his Meti returned to the outside world, his wisdom made visible. When Zeus needed to think through a difficult decision, he often turned to Athena. When Zeus was on the verge of an impulsive action, Athena was often the one who quietly suggested another course. The father and daughter ran the household of Olympus together in many of the old stories, in a way that the marriage of Zeus and Hera never quite achieved. Hera ruled the household by right, Athena counselled it by wisdom. The two roles did not always conflict, but when they did, Zeus often listened to Athena. She was also the goddess of cities, of the long human work of building and maintaining the structures of civic life. Athens was her primary city, but she was honoured in many other places. Her temples often stood on the highest point of a city, as the Parthenon stood on the Acropolis. The Parthenon itself, built in the 5th century before our era, was one of the great architectural achievements of the ancient world. Its proportions were so carefully calculated that the columns appear straight, even though they are subtly curved. The floor appears flat, even though it bows slightly to compensate for the eye's tendency to read flat surfaces as concave. The building was a testament to the kind of intelligence Athena represented. The intelligence that knows how to make things appear simple by being, underneath, exquisitely complicated. Inside the Parthenon stood the great statue of Athena Parthenos, the maiden Athena, made by the sculptor Phidias. The statue was nearly 40 feet tall, fashioned of gold and ivory over a wooden core. She stood holding her spear and a small image of Nike, the goddess of victory, in her outstretched hand. Her shield rested at her side, with the head of Medusa in its center. The interior of the shield, the old descriptions say, was painted with scenes of the contests of the gods and giants. Her sandals, her helmet, her aegis, all worked in fine gold. The statue must have been astonishing to see, lit by the lamps of the temple and by the daylight falling through the great east door at dawn. The statue is gone now. It vanished sometime in late antiquity, perhaps taken to Constantinople, perhaps broken up for the value of its gold. But the temple still stands, partly ruined, but recognizable, on the Acropolis above modern Athens. The columns are weathered, the roof is gone, the marble has turned in places a soft gold under centuries of sun. The building remembers what stood inside it, even though what stood inside it has been gone for 1,500 years. The patience of stone preserves the memory of what no longer lives. There were other temples of Athena on the Acropolis besides the Parthenon. The Erechtheion was an unusual building dedicated to her in her older, more local form, the form connected to the legendary king Erechtheus, who was identified with Erichthonios. The Erechtheion housed the tomb of the king and certain sacred relics, including a wooden statue of Athena that was older and more revered than the great gold and ivory statue in the Parthenon. The Erechtheion is famous now for its porch of caryatids, 6 tall sculpted women who serve as columns supporting the porch roof, their robes flowing like water, their faces serene under the weight they carry. They have stood there for more than 2,000 years, supporting their roof, watching the centuries change around them. There was the temple of Athena Nike, Also, on the Acropolis, a small, elegant building dedicated to Athena as the goddess of victory. It stood on a high bastion at the western entrance to the rock, the first temple a visitor saw when climbing up to the Acropolis. Inside was a statue of Nike, the winged goddess of victory, but with her wings removed in the Athenian image so that victory would not fly away from the city. The Greeks loved this small theological trick. They imagined their gods so concretely that they thought a wingless statue could keep victory grounded among them. The small Nike temple is still there, restored in recent times, its proportions perfect, its position elegant above the long view of the city below. There was the temple of Athena Polias, the city goddess, again on the Acropolis. There were temples in many other cities, at Sparta, at Argos, at Lindos on Rhodes, at Sunion at the southern tip of Attica, where her temple still stands on a high promontory overlooking the sea. Each of these temples honoured a different aspect of her: the maiden, the victor, the city keeper, the patron of crafts, the watcher over harbours and high places. The Athenian festival of the Panathenea was her great civic celebration held every 4 years in midsummer. The festival included athletic games, musical and poetic contests, and a great procession that wound up the slope of the Acropolis to the Parthenon. The procession carried a new peplos, a great woven robe, which was placed on the older wooden statue of Athena in the Erechtheion. The peplos had been woven by chosen young women of the city in the months leading up to the festival, and its weaving was itself a sacred act, an act of weaving the city's relationship with its goddess into actual cloth. The Parthenon frieze, much of which is now in the British Museum in London, depicts this procession in marble. Horsemen, musicians, young men and women carrying offerings, the slow, careful winding of the city up the rock to meet its goddess. This festival lasted for many centuries. It survived the various wars and political changes that swept through Athens. It was held even when the city was no longer politically dominant. The peplos was woven, the procession climbed the rock, the goddess was honoured. The continuity of this practice across so many years was itself a kind of testimony to Athena's particular role. She was the goddess of patient making, and the festival was an exercise in patient making. Cloth woven slowly across months, a procession climbing slowly up a rock, a robe placed reverently on a wooden statue. Nothing about it was hurried. Nothing about it was loud. The goddess of the prepared mind was honoured by a city that prepared its honour for her over months and miles. There were also smaller mortal stories of Athena, ones less famous than the heroic epics that the old Greeks preserved in local traditions and small inscriptions. There was Agloros, one of the daughters of Erichthonios's foster line, who threw herself from the Acropolis when the city was threatened by invasion in a sacrifice that was said to please Athena and to ensure the city's safety. Her tomb on the Acropolis was honoured for centuries. There was Tritogenia, an epithet of Athena that connected her to the river Triton where she had been raised, and that some local traditions in Boeotia and elsewhere used to claim a particular closeness to her. There was the small story of a girl named Myrmex who claimed to have invented the plough that Athena had taught her, and who was turned into an ant in punishment, becoming the ancestor of the Myrmidons, the ant people who would later fight under Achilles in the Trojan War. These small stories give Athena a presence in the daily lives of the ancient Greeks that the great temple statues do not quite convey. She was not only the goddess of the Parthenon, she was the goddess of the small workshop, the small loom, the small farm tool, the small mortal life that needed careful attention to its small work. Pottery painters in the workshops of the Athenian quarter, called kerameikos, signed their best pieces with prayers to Athena. Shipbuilders at the harbour of Piraeus invoked her before laying the first keel of a new vessel. Olive farmers at the borders of Attica left small offerings at her altars before the first picking of the autumn. The goddess of the great rock was also the goddess of every small daily skill the city depended on. The Greeks understood that the truest gods were not those who showed up only at grand moments. The truest gods were the ones whose presence ran through ordinary life like a thread through cloth. Athena was such a god. The farmer at the plough, the woman at the loom, the smith at the forge, the sailor at the rope, the scribe at the wax tablet, the philosopher in the agora, the magistrate in the council chamber, the young woman lighting the morning lamp in her father's house. All of these moved under her quiet patronage. To call her the goddess of wisdom is correct but incomplete. She was the goddess of attentive action, of the work that knows what it is doing. Around Athena, in the old imagery, gathered certain small attendant creatures and signs. The owl was hers. The owl who sees in the dark, who hunts by silence, whose round eyes face forward and whose head can turn nearly all the way around, became the bird most closely associated with her. To see an owl was, in the old Athenian sensibility, to feel that Athena was near. The owl appeared on the coins of Athens, which became known across the Mediterranean as the owls, the most reliable currency of the ancient world. The owl perched on her shoulder in many paintings. The owl was the small daily reminder of the goddess of patient seeing. The olive tree, of course, was also hers. The branch of olive became the symbol of peace as well as of her city, and the laurel of poetry and the olive of wisdom together formed two of the most enduring plant images of Greek myth. To be crowned with olive in an athletic victory at Olympia or in a civic honor at Athens was to be marked as one favored by Athena, even in fields she did not directly preside over. The Aegis, her great storm shield, was another of her signs. It was made, in some traditions, from the skin of the goat Amalthea, who had fed the infant Zeus on Crete. Zeus wore the Aegis at certain moments, and so did Athena. To carry the Aegis was to carry a piece of the divine weather, the storm, and the brightness together. The head of Medusa, set in its center, gave the Aegis its particular paralyzing effect on those who saw it raised against them. To stand before Athena's Aegis in battle was to feel the world go still around you. There were other small details that the Greeks attached to her, each adding to the texture of her presence. She did not marry, the old tradition insisted. She had chosen to remain a maiden, which is what Parthenos means. The choice was a particular kind of independence in the old world, where most goddesses were paired with husbands or lovers. Athena had a few small attachments, mostly platonic, like her long friendship with Odysseus, but she did not enter into the kind of marriages that defined Hera or Aphrodite. She belonged in some sense to herself. She also did not have children, though the old myths invented one curious near exception. Erichthonios was a child she was said to have raised, though not born. The story has Hephaestus approaching Athena with desire and Athena refusing him. Hephaestus's seed fell to the earth, and from the earth grew the child Erichthonios. Athena, who had not wanted Hephaestus, but did want the child, took the boy and raised him in secret on the Acropolis. He grew up to become one of the early kings of Athens. The story is strange, and the old singers told it carefully, neither making Athena a mother in the ordinary sense nor denying her connection to the child. Erythonios, in the old Athenian imagination, was the founding king they associated most closely with their goddess. There is something tender in this strange parentage. Athena, who could not have a child by any ordinary means, still raised a child. She placed the infant in a basket and gave it to the daughters of Cecrops, the first king of Athens, with instructions never to open the basket. The daughters, of course, eventually opened it. What they saw inside, the old story says, was a child with a serpent's tail in place of legs, or a child with serpents coiled around him. The sight drove the daughters mad, and they threw themselves from the Acropolis. Athena, sorrowful, took the child back and raised him herself. Erythonios grew up. He became king. He instituted the festival of the Panathenaea in honor of his foster mother. The cycle of the city's relationship with its goddess began with this strange, small story of an earthborn child raised in secret. It is moving to think about the goddess of wisdom, who had never been a mother in the ordinary sense, became a mother in a stranger sense. The child she raised was not of her body, but of her care. The city she founded was not of her body, but of her choosing. The relationships of Athena were almost all of this kind, chosen, not inherited, built, not born, tended slowly across long years of attention, rather than produced in any single moment of biological event. The goddess of patient making made her household the same way she made her cloth, by careful attention, thread by thread, choice by choice. For now, remember this. Athena's wisdom was not the wisdom of speaking much. The Greeks noticed that she was, in many of her stories, quiet. She listened, she watched, she acted only when action would be effective. The owl, with its silent flight, was perhaps a truer emblem of her than the spear. She did not need to perform. She did not need to convince. She was already prepared. There is in her a model of a particular kind of strength that the old Greeks valued, and that later traditions sometimes lost sight of. It is the strength of the prepared mind, the patient eye, the indirect approach. It is the strength of choosing the olive tree over the salt spring, the long, slow nourishment over the bright, dramatic gesture. It is the strength of supporting a wandering man for 10 years without ever quite saving him outright, because the saving had to be done by his own choices, with her quiet help moving in the background. It simply was, in the old Greek imagination, that wisdom and craft and patience were one thing. The same goddess who taught the women of the household to weave was the same goddess who taught the strategists of the city to plan a campaign. The same goddess who watched over the building of the Parthenon was the same goddess who watched over the slow tying of a sandal. There was no distinction in her between the great and the small. The owl's eye was as careful at a mouse in the field as at a moonlit ridge. The weaver's eye was as careful at the single thread as at the finished cloth. The later Greek philosophers, the ones who would eventually shift from myth to abstract thought, took up the figure of Athena and turned it gently. The Stoics, the Platonists, the various schools of thought that flourished in Athens and across the Hellenistic world all found something to honor in her. She was, for them, the goddess of the examined life. She was the goddess of asking before acting, of pausing before speaking, of considering before believing. Her city, Athens, became the home of philosophy, in large part because the city had been shaped by her patronage. The agora, where Socrates would later walk, asking his questions, was a few steps from her temple. The schools of philosophy that grew up around the city, the Academy of Plato, the Lyceum of Aristotle, the Stoa, where the Stoics gathered, all were in some sense late expressions of her gift to the place. It is moving to think of this long arc. A goddess emerges from a god's head. She plants an olive tree on a high rock. The city built around the rock becomes the place where thought itself learns to walk slowly through the streets, asking questions, considering answers, examining its own assumptions. The patron of the city presides invisibly over centuries of conversation that begin to shape the long history of human reflection. The olive tree, the small, slow gift, turns out to have been the foundation of an immense intellectual inheritance. Athens became Athens. Philosophy became philosophy. The careful mind, the patient eye, the indirect approach, all of these became part of what the long human conversation now is, and it began on a rock above a small harbour where a goddess and a god offered their gifts and the people chose the smaller one. But that is a story for another day. The way she gathered all these aspects into one continuous presence across centuries of worship. Tonight, we will only mark it. We will only note that Athena, as the Greeks imagined her, was a particular kind of intelligence, and that intelligence was the kind that does not call attention to itself. It works in the background, it supports without claiming credit, it plants the olive tree, it carves the wooden palladium, it hands the polished shield to Perseus, it comes to Odysseus as a shepherd. It is so quiet that mortals, helped by it, often think they have succeeded by themselves. The Greeks valued this kind of help even when they did not always recognize it. They knew, in their philosophical moments, that the wisest assistance is the assistance that lets the person being helped feel as though they have done it themselves. A teacher who shows a student the answer too quickly has taken something from the student. A teacher who lets the student work toward the answer, asking only the right small questions at the right moments, has given the student the answer, and also given them the experience of having found it. Athena was the goddess of that second kind of teaching. She was the goddess of careful, indirect support. She was the goddess of teachers, of advisors, of the older mentor who waits patiently while the younger student tries and fails and tries again. There is in the figure of Athena, taken as a whole, a quality the old Greeks valued highly but did not always name. It is something like dignified attention. She is always there, in the rooms of her temples, in the lamps of her city, in the eyes of her owl, in the silver of her olive leaves. She does not press herself upon you, she does not demand your constant gaze, but when you look toward her, she is present and she is calm and she has been there long before you and she will be there long after. The Greeks who slept under her watch felt, even when they were not thinking about her, that someone wise was awake somewhere in the city. There is in her a particular gift for the listener tonight. The day has been full of small, attentive actions, whatever else it was. The brushing of teeth in the morning, the folding of a piece of clothing, the careful pouring of a cup of water, the signing of a name, the closing of a door, the walking from one room to another, Each of these small things was, in an old Greek way of thinking, also work done under Athena's quiet eye. There is no need for grandeur. There is no need for spectacle. The small, attentive actions of an ordinary day are what the goddess of the prepared mind has always loved best. The Greeks who lived under Athena's quiet patronage understood that the world's continuance depended less on heroic acts than on the slow accumulation of careful daily work. The wall that kept the city safe had been built one stone at a time by patient masons. The cloth that warmed the family had been woven one thread at a time by patient women. The bread that fed the household had been kneaded one batch at a time by patient hands. The harvest that filled the granaries had been picked one olive at a time by patient farmers. None of this was glorious in the way the heroic stories were glorious. None of it would have made a song, but all of it was Athena's. The bright, loud stories of Perseus and Heracles and Odysseus drew the ear of the audience, but the quiet, long stories of stone-laying and cloth-weaving and olive-picking were where the goddess of wisdom actually lived, day after day, in the lives of the people she watched over. This is one of the gentle lessons the old myth offers for a sleep story. The hero gets the song, but the goddess of wisdom belongs more truly to the patient labor that has no song. The listener who lies in bed at the end of an ordinary day with no great deeds to count has not been outside Athena's notice. She has been watching the careful, small work of the hours. She has been there at the small, attentive actions, at the considered choices, at the moments of patience that the day asked of you and that you gave. She knows what it took. She honors it in her quiet way, even when no one else would think to. There is something quietly comforting in this idea. The goddess of wisdom is not only the patron of the great deeds, she is the patron of the small, carefully done ones. She is at the loom when no one is praising the weaver. She is at the forge when no one is praising the smith. She is at the table when no one is praising the cook. She is at the bedside when no one is praising the parent. The long daily work of attentive living happens under her eye, and it is enough. It does not need to be heroic to be honored. The night is older now, and the story has carried us far. Let us gather the figures and let them settle. Metis, who became a drop of dew and was drunk down. Hephaestus, with his axe, doing the strange medical work of opening a divine skull. Athena, stepping forth fully armed, her grey eyes already calculating the long future. Triton's river, where she was raised. Pallas, who fell. The Palladium, that small wooden figure of a girl, becoming the protector of cities. The Acropolis, the olive tree, the salt spring, the people choosing patience over power. Arachne at her loom, becoming a spider in her grief and her pride. Perseus with his shield, Heracles with his bronze rattle, Odysseus on his long voyage attended by an unseen friend. The Parthenon, the Erechtheion, the little temple of Athena Nike at the entrance to the rock, the owl, the Aegis, the great statue, gold and ivory, lifted up in lamplight. Erichthonios, the earthborn child, raised in secret on the Acropolis, the slow centuries of philosophers walking in the agora below the temple, the Panathenaea procession winding up the rock with its woven robe, Aglauros, who threw herself from the rock for the city, the small workshops of the Keramakos where potters signed their names, the shipyards of Piraeus where shipwrights laid keels, the olive groves of Attica where farmers picked the slow fruit of their goddess's gift. These are the figures of Athena's mythology, and you do not have to hold them. They are mentioned only so that they may settle. Let the names drift down like leaves into water. Let the images soften. Let the long history of the goddess of wisdom become a quiet weight in the room, the way a high ceiling is a quiet weight, holding without insisting. Now, let the story loosen, the way every long-telling must when sleep approaches. Let the Acropolis fade into a pale ridge against a darker sky. Let the olive tree on its high rock fold its silver leaves for the night. Let the great statue lower its golden spear. Let the owl, which has been listening from somewhere in the dark, close its round eyes. Let Triton's river run quietly in a place we do not need to visit tonight. Let Pallas, in whatever afterlife the old myths assign to her, sleep beside her friend. Let the small wooden palladium rest in its hidden chamber. Let the caryatids of the Erechtheion continue their patient holding, without us needing to watch them. Let the small temple of Athena Nike stand on its bastion, the wingless victory inside it staying with the city. Let the workshops below the rock grow quiet for the night, the looms covered, the wheels stilled, the hammers laid down beside their forges. Good evening and welcome back, one last time, to the slow, gentle work of letting the story rest. The night has carried Athena a long way, from a goddess in her father's head to a patient watcher of heroes, to a great statue in a great temple. There are many other tellings of her, many other moments, many other heroes she helped, many other small mortals she walked past in disguise. But that is a story for another day. The grove of her mythology is wide enough that no single knight can walk all its paths. There is a final image that the old singers like to leave with their listeners at the end of an Athena story. It is the image of the goddess at evening on the roof of her own great temple, looking out over her city as the lamps below began their small bright awakening one by one. Behind her, the great doors of the Parthenon stood open to the warm air. Below her, the streets of the city wound through their familiar shapes, with the agora to the north and the harbour to the south and the long roads leading away toward Eleusis and Marathon and the other places that mattered. She did not need to descend. She did not need to inspect each house. She knew her city. She knew the work that had been done that day, the weaving, the building, the sailing, the thinking, the cooking, the teaching, the small kindnesses passed between neighbours. She watched them all settle now into the quiet of evening. She let them go. Then she turned, the old image says, and went back into her temple, and the night took the city. And the city slept under the dark wing of its goddess, and somewhere in the streets a lamp was lit, and somewhere a child was put to bed, and somewhere a long thought was finished, and the philosopher rolled up his scroll for the night, and somewhere a weaver covered the loom with cloth, and the long human work of attentive living paused for a few hours before resuming with the dawn. For now, remember this: tonight, the work of the tale is done. It simply was, like all old stories, the carrying of the patient, grey-eyed mind through the long inheritance of nights. Let the names settle. Let the room settle. Let the night gather you up. Imagine the high Acropolis far behind you, the olive tree and the salt spring and the great temple no longer pressing on your thoughts. In your mind, reach back and close an invisible door to the rock of Athens, feeling it move on silent hinges, sealing the Aegis, the owl, the loom, the grey eye, and the long patient watching of the goddess in calm and order. Then see a single candle its flame steady in the darkness. With a slow, gentle breath, blow that candle out and let the last curl of light fade into the night. Rest well, sleep deeply, and let the ancient stories carry you into the night.